All right, welcome to the third quarter of what's new with eRIS, or what's new in eRIS. Three main parts we'll kind of highlight and go over today are some of the stuff in the mobile app 4.5.0, which is about to be released just around the corner. So what you can expect to see when that gets released. Some improvements to our remote agent, eRIS Remote Agent 4.0, just different exporting options, better troubleshooting abilities, and just overall more external control of the agent. And then the last one is an exciting kind of new product. It's called eHistorian or eRIS Historian, just a data historian that we'll kind of go over later, just some new stuff that we've been working on. So I'll go into the first item here, which is the mobile app 4.5.0. 4.5.0 introduces a new and improved filter dialog for logbook entries. It has more, we talked about this in our last what's new in eRIS was the logbook periods. Mobile app 4.5.0 introduces the mobile side of support for those logbook periods. So the mobile app can actually interact and utilize logbooks that are under a user-defined logbook periods. It also introduces some exports so that you can actually get some logging out of the app, just a new troubleshooting tool that we've added. Also bug logging, which may or may not make Brian excited over on his end that the app can log bugs. So I have here what I'll open up as my simulator, which is a version 4.5.0 of the app. I'll move over to settings. Some of these ones you may have seen. I'm actually just going to touch on a few of them as well, just in case we've never gone over them before. It's distracting. The first one is reset local data. This is just an option to clear the app of everything that it has, that it's currently stored onto itself. Just kind of give it a bit of a restart. Instead of having to uninstall and reinstall the app, we introduce this setting to clear out the local cache of the app itself. The next one is a new option, this export data for support. This is going to just give you a JSON file of everything that the app has data-wise. So the options that it's synced, the entries it's synced, entries that you've created that maybe are not getting sent out for some reason. This just gives us something to look at ourselves and say, okay, if something isn't working, the support team and the development team can actually take a look further into what the app actually has itself, where previously we were kind of in the dark. User says my entry won't sync, I can't get it to go anywhere, but we can't physically get a hold of that device wherever it may be to see what may be stored. So this setting allows you to export what we have locally on the device, and you can actually send it. Now, this is a simulator, and I have no context on my app, so you can't see all the right options, but I have a screenshot here of what this will kind of look like. I've photoshopped Brian and Ryan's faces here to what it will look like when you actually do an export. So you can choose to send it over email, Teams. You can send it to your local eRIS support person or to support desk email as well. It's the same thing for the app logs. It's the same kind of dialogue. This app logs is just going to be more of a text file, just like this is what the app was doing over the course of X amount of time. These are also helpful for us because they might have some errors in them or just give us a better understanding of what the app was trying to do, whether or not the data was valid or not, if it could complete it. The other new option is this report a bug. And here you're going to get a dialog here. We can actually enter, my entries won't sync. And this is actually going to send a ticket right to the eRIS support desk, right to eRIS support. And it's going to include the app logs and the app data right together. This way you can kind of send out your ticket right from the app itself without having to fumble around with different files to save onto your phone and figure out how you're going to get it over to eRIS or to someone within your organization to get over to eRIS support. Some of these options I'll just kind of go over quickly just because I don't think we've ever really talked about them too much, but there's show logbook labels, which is exactly what it means. Do labels show up in your entries list? Show closed forms. Do forms show up? Forms that are completed show up in your list. The show logbook date picker just chooses, if you have this set to on, if you go into a logbook, I'm going to use eRIS test logbook. When you create a new entry, the date picker automatically flies up. without any user interaction on this date picker. And if you turn that option off, you manually have to select that option, just a preference. Logbook pin entry color, which I think is something relatively new, determines how your pinned entries show up color-wise. So you get this nice color wheel that you can pick some colors to choose how your logbook pins get colored. This last one here, I know is a newer one, and it's a bit of a more confusing one. With certain Android devices, we have run into issues where the predictive text in the input fields actually slows down the app significantly. As you're typing, as you type more and more words, the predictive text options do more scanning within your logbook entries, which ends up kind of bogging down the application itself as you're typing. So for iOS devices, this doesn't really seem to be an issue for us and the framework that we use to create these apps, React Native. So for iOS, this option is toggled to yes, like enabled predictive text is available when you go into the app or install the app for the first time, because it doesn't seem to affect Apple. But if you are using Android, by default, this is turned off. But you do have the option to come in and turn this on if you are used to predictive text when you're typing logbook entries.
Hey John,
yeah.
Why would somebody want to turn off labels?
So if I turn off, show logbook labels, just because of how they look on this screen, if it's just taking up too much space. So here we have 2 labels here. These are all test entries, but you can see they appear here. And you might not want to see these until you actually go in and you view them here. It's just a preference item to show or not show the labels within the logbook entry list. So now if I come back here, those labels are gone and I don't see them.
But it doesn't remove the labels from the entry. It just shows them on the list view, correct?
Yeah, it's purely display purposes. So now I don't see labels, and I'll go back and just turn that on one more time. As we go through here, now I have 2 entries. So it's just displayed. Labels are not removed when you do that. They are not disabled. You can still see labels when you go into the actual entry. It's purely a display thing on the front side. And as a small note, in future versions, these items do get a makeover, and they look a little nicer than this bar here. So the last thing I mentioned for 4.5.0 is the logbook support, or support for logbook periods, which is what we talked about in our last session, how logbook entries and shifts don't need to take up a 24-hour period from midnight to midnight. They can take up a 24-hour period for how many periods within that time range that you wish. So for this one, there's an AM, PM, and I think there's an early or an after hour period. So before this app always showed entries more like this under the BL test, where it was just Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, daily logbook entries, where now the app can support logbook periods, where it shows PM, and then it shows a range of what that logbook period is set for. And when you're creating and editing shifts, you're picking a shift for PM, the PM period. If I create a new one, I get to pick a different period. So I can create shifts for an after hour logbook period. Where previously you could only do this for a daily basis. So which day, and that was it. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just interject in here that I apologize, or we apologize for the confusion of the labeling or the wording between periods and shifts. If we had it to do all over again, we probably would have changed what we called shifts to begin with. We wouldn't have called them shifts because it is a little bit confusing. So you have to kind of learn the lingo a little bit, but periods, I think, more represent what most organizations call shifts. And then the shifts log that we have, or the shift log that we create, can either align with those periods or not. It's up to you to define how they align with the periods. But the periods allow you to just purely organize the entries into groupings by those periods. rather than just days. So that's really the difference.
Yeah, good point, Tim. Does anyone have any questions on these mobile app items or features, extensions, or anything like that? Take that as a no. I'll move right along over to the next option. I'm just going to minimize that in case you come back to it. All right, so the next, yeah.
This is Juan.
Is that one?
Yeah.
One.
Hey, when I log into my eRIS logbook on my phone,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm logging in, I put in my server and my username, but then the keyboard thing comes up, and I can't see where to enter my password.
Oh, I see what you're talking about. Yep.
You guys are aware of that?
I don't know which or where we looked at that using Android one.
Okay,
It's
I'm on Apple.
Okay.
It's
I'm on an Apple phone.
the versions before 4.5.0 when the keyboard covers the password field, but the beta version that's out right now, it doesn't do that. That's
Okay,
why
got it.
your screen there, John, you can see the password, but
Gets
on the
pushed up.
versions before that, yeah, it's the keyboard covers over it. So you have to get rid of your keyboard to see if your password is in there or not.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's fixed in the new version. Okay.
Yeah, so you'll see that coming. So you'll see the nice new logo one, the new eRIS logo at the top, and then it should get pushed up properly.
Okay, great. Thanks.
But in the meantime, Juan, what you can do is just
I can get in there.
physically with your finger.
I've learned how to get in there.
Yeah, yeah. It is a pain. Yeah, we have solved it though. Appreciate it. Okay, good.
Okay.
So you know the workaround. Awesome.
John, before
Great.
you go back,
Yeah.
when you were showing the shifts by the shifts versus the day, how did you make that happen?
So that is a setting within eRIS itself. If I go over to this mobile test. Just show it quickly. I thought this might come up. This is the logbook that I'm using, courtesy of Ernie, one of our team members. Under logbook periods, you have to do a defined 24-hour period. It does. It's not retroactive, so it's only future going forward. It will still organize your previous shifts in different ways on the desktop and the back end. I think maybe if Aqua, you guys wanted to pursue this, we maybe would want to have a conversation just on how we can make this work.
You still can't go over the 24-hour period though, right? Like, so if you have a shift that goes from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., you still have to end it at midnight and start it again?
It can start and end whatever time. It just has to be 24 hours. So in this case, I go 7 to 1500 hours and 1500 hours to 2300 hours and then 2300 hours till 7 a.m. the next day. So my start and end are at the same time. But if I actually try and add another one here after hours, and I do 7 o'clock to another time, actually your range exceeds 24 hours, so that it won't let you. You can add it here, you just can't save the logbook anymore. And the same happens if you actually remove one of these. You're going to get an error. It's not going to let you. I'm just going to cancel that so I don't mess up that logbook. But
okay, yeah, so that's only useful then if you have plants that are 24 hours then, right? Because other plants wouldn't necessarily have a 24-hour shift.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to hop back over. Yeah, so our next item is the eRIS Remote Agent 4.0. For those of you who don't know what the remote agent is or why we have it, or what problem it solves, is there are certain database or historians that we can only make OLEDB connections, Microsoft connections, OLEDB or ODBC. Some ones like Prophecy and Wonderware we make OLEDB connections. SQL Server does support it, but we don't need to make an OLEDB connection to connect to SQL Server. But I just put it in the list because that's basically what's kind of running with these two guys here. So we cannot make direct OLEDB connections to Windows because the only way to make that connection to one of those databases is from a Windows machine or a C# Windows supported Microsoft client. So in order to get around this, we created the eRIS remote agent. The current version of it was created a while ago. I think there's been 2 versions of it since, and we've just been kind of supporting it. And we basically do is we make a REST call or a call over the internet to the remote agent that sits running on a server, running as a server or a Windows service on the Windows server. And then that agent actually interacts with the database and then compiles all those results and then sends them back to eRIS. So the agent is the one that's directly responsible for knowing how to connect to these Microsoft or SQL Server OLEDB type connection databases. So that's kind of the problem that we had a while ago, and this was the solution, so that eRIS could still pull data out of gPrivacy and Wonderware and certain SQL Server type environments. Factory Talk is another one. So what's new? What have we done differently? The new remote, there's some remote and external improvements. So there's a management UI that I'll go over in a bit. There's new logging. You can actually tail logs as they happen. You can also adjust logging levels to try and determine what is actually going wrong or what is the agent doing. Why can't I connect to my data source remotely? Then there's also a new exporting feature allowed from that agent. So you can actually export results over TCP/IP, HTTPS, and also FTP exports as well. It is also backwards compatible. So using the new 4.0 agent doesn't mean everything on eRIS stops working. As long as it's connected at the same place on the same port, those previously existing calls that our prophecy provider and other providers make are still supported, and they know how to handle those. So I'm going to go back and I'll just show the user interface here. And something to go over as well, this interface right now is open, but there is a way to secure this. So in our previous versions of the remote agent, there's no way to block or restrict access directly to the agent. Everything is kind of sitting on that network path that you can access and make calls to get data, and as well as debug statements. So with this new agent, there is a way to restrict that with a query parameter. So I have that turned off for now because I want to make sure that I can still get to it. But that is another new feature within the eRIS agent is some security added. So first and foremost, when you start on the page, it's just going to give you some basic service stats. There's a start time. So I've had this agent running on the Windows machine to the left of me here since the 24th of August. This time just gives a quick agent version. So I'm sitting on a 4.0 because it's still in development. We haven't moved anywhere past it. There's also this export statistics, which shows what exports have been run, the last time it ran, how many failed, and how many data points has it actually executed. Down here is there's 2 types of providers that I would call, not to be confused with an eRIS provider, or 2 different connection types, is OLEDB and ODBC, as I mentioned before. So on my agent, my OLEDB has made 500 and it completed 448 of them. I know a lot of them I was making invalid calls, so that's why there's a bit of a gap here as to why my completed is less than my actual call. Down here, I have the ODBC count. I'm not currently testing any ODBC connections, so there's been none. This is something the old agent did. There was just nowhere to really visualize it in this way. So here I can actually see the calls that have been made to the agent when they started, when they end, and then also how many data points were actually extracted. Now I'm running quite a large export where it's actually paging them, so I'm always getting 50,000 records on every call. There's also a refresh button, so when we click this, it's actually going to bring in the latest data, which hasn't changed much, I guess, since the last time I refreshed, but this refresh just kind of brings up this screen. The next kind of tab or screen that you can kind of look at here is providers. Again, this is something the old agent did allow on a REST call, it just gave it to you in a non-desired, kind of easy to read format. And these providers are just kind of the providers that the Windows machine or the agent has detected exist, drivers that exist on the Windows machine to make calls. It's not necessarily a direct, there's data in all of these, just what kind of providers are available. So I have my SQL Server ODBC, and I have a SQL Server, where is it? Should have a SQL Server OLEDB. Yeah, SQL Server OLEDB driver as well. And this is one that I'd be using to make calls. There's just information, you know, Factory Talk, I think, shows up in this list if it's installed on the server. So just kind of let you know, hey, why can't I connect to my Factory Talk? Oh, it doesn't even show up on my providers list. That must mean it's not set up right on the Windows machine. I'm going to skip to the logs screen for now. So I'll come back to the exports. The log screen has a rolling of, looks like 5 logs I have configured right now. So it'll keep track of logs for 5 days in the past. You can also download these logs manually, but down here, this screen actually shows you the exact, the logs that are happening kind of live, and it will roll. So I just had another log pop up. I think this is in UTC. Oh no, this is current time. So every 30 seconds, it checks to see if there are any exports to run, and it says no exports run. Checking export definitions, updated, just little things. And right now I'm in a debug mode. So this log has info and debug entries here. But you can also look back and say, oh, well, I know that my agent wasn't giving me data on the 28th. So you can actually just click on that, and you can actually just download that log file, and you can open it up, whatever editor you want to use, and you can just see the logs for that day. And it just keeps rolling. So I'm going to hold on to them for 5 days by default, so that we don't keep running out of storage, or people wonder why there's a 10 gig log file on the server. You can pause this. You can also clear this log, just so you can start from scratch and then run a query in eRIS and just see what the agent says. If there's anything useful, you should see the error messages actually show up as red in here. They won't be white. You'll get a big error block like this, and the rest of that message will be in red. So it should stand out easily. So as I mentioned before, up here, there's log level that you can see. There's debug, trace, information warning, just different granularity of what kind of information you're looking for, and how, if you're really trying to find something that seems obscure, you might want to switch up to trace. The problem is, of course, then you're just going to get more log messages, so it's harder to filter, and it's just nice to kind of find the right balance. Typically, information is good enough. It's just going to give you the errors and any information that the app is running. The max current connections and request timeout are things that we've included just because the original agent had those options as well. Previously, the concurrent connections, I think, worked differently on the previous versions with C#, which is what this agent is written in. So the max current connections basically says how many connections are you allowed to run at the exact same time. So if your max current connections is 3 and there's 3 calls ongoing and someone tries to make a 4th one, they will be rejected. Defaulted star, there's no limit on max concurrent connections. This is something that would kind of be tweaked on a server or client basis, depending on how heavy the agent would be used, and we'd have to kind of explore other options too, if there's more options or more restrictions happening. The request timeout is how long is a request allowed to take on the system. So, and this is in seconds, how long should this actually take up time on the system? There's also a save and reset. So if you start making changes, but you're not sure about them, you can hit reset to just get back to previous settings. Something that is also new is this restart service function here. In order for this to work, you do have to have a certain setting set in your agent here. Depending and this is the easiest way to do it, is to set the agent up as a Windows service. This is typically how we've done it in the past, as an automatic Windows service. The recovery has to be set to restart agent on all first failure, second failure, and any other failure after that. The reason for that is Windows doesn't really, or C# doesn't really have a way to just restart the program itself. So what this restart does is actually it stops the agent, and then Windows will automatically take care of restarting it. But this was something that we felt we needed because sometimes the old agent, we needed to restart it. And in order to do that, we would have to get a lot of access to get on the machine. So we added this restart service as a troubleshooting trick for us as well. So the last part of this is the new export definitions. Something that the agent has only ever been able to do in the past is retrieve data on a request basis, where there are some new settings now to actually send data based off of a scheduled basis. So you can create exports, and these exports can go to an eRIS server through an API export, or they can go to an FTP site on an FTP export, or it can go to both. You can set up one export job to send it in both locations. So what does it want? It wants a name, something to identify it. Is enabled, yes or no? What provider are you using, OLEDB or ODBC? Do you want to do a table or type tag? And I'll get into that. What is the connection string of how this data is going to happen, or how are we going to connect to the data source to pull data from? What table is the data coming from? What columns do you want from that table, and where the where clause of that SQL query? And you notice I have this kind of curly bracket parameterized setting here, and this is just so your export can be set to, you could get rid of where, and basically in this case I'm going to export the entire table every single time. But if you add this where, you can say, where time is less than the last time this ran, and that last run is set here, and this will automatically get updated every time this export runs based off of this frequency, and this is in minutes. So right now this runs every minute, but I'm going to change it to 15 minutes for now. For an API export, this just means this agent is going to send it to, essentially it's going to send it just to eRIS. And in order to send to eRIS, any eRIS version after 3.0, it's going to require an access token so that the eRIS knows that whoever's trying to send data to eRIS is actually authorized to do so. So that's where this access token comes in. I don't know if we've gone over it in a eRIS What's New, but there is ways to do that within user preferences, and we can go over that for those who need to. The destination URL is, well, where is the eRIS, and what endpoint are you sending this data to, and which provider should this data go to? So in this case, because I'm using a table type export, I'm sending this to a table provider in eRIS. But if I switch to my other definition here, the type is of tag, and a few things do change here. Table, columns, and where all stay the same. However, there's a new option for a tag query, because what we're basically looking at here is this would be the data for tags, and this tag query would be, well, how do I get, what are your tag definitions from this system? And these could look at the same table, but just queried in a different way. But that's why we have this, the two different types. So a table is basically you're just kind of sending column rows straight up from the agent to eRIS, where the tags is you're sending specific tag data. So for Prophecy, this tag or this select statement would look different because you'd be looking at a different kind of tag table, and the data you'd be looking at whatever data you wanted to pull out with the where clause. Again, there's the same frequency in the last run. There is one other change to this guy too, and it's the tag destination URL. And that's just when we export tag definitions from this tag query, it needs to go to a different destination than the other destination URL. These things I actually might want to be simplifying as we release this agent down the road. I try to make this flexible or more flexible, but I think we can simplify the way these are used in the future. I'll go back to the other one because it had an FTP export. The FTP export can be done in JSON or XML, and this data then just gets sent to an FTP site that you provide under a certain port. You can set what encryption is being used on that FTP connection, and then you just need a user and password and the folder where it goes. Now, the last option is if you are doing an FTP connection that requires a certificate, you can enter in that path. Now that path has to point to a certificate on the Windows machine that this agent is running on. But I've kept those options in place, so if anyone is setting up certain export jobs to FTPs, they can do that. And you can do both. If you have both of these options all filled in, then it's going to send all that data to either location. Before I move into the next little bit, does anyone have any questions or anything they want to mention on the eRIS agent?
So I'm going to jump in here, John, because lots of technical background and we've got lots of different people on the call.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the most important thing to understand about this is, so why would somebody use this? Or, you know, when in a typical eRIS implementation, what John is showing, especially with this export, is not, you don't implement that. Okay. It just, the eRIS server talks behind the scenes to the eRIS agent. The eRIS agent makes the requests and returns it back to eRIS, and the end user doesn't really care about this. But the reason why we're showing you this is because we've had a couple of use cases around situations where the source data is in or behind or the entity or the customer wants that data source to be in a really highly secure area where only data is being pushed out, as opposed to that request from eRIS going into that environment and then requesting the data and pulling it out. Okay. So I know John was going to talk about this, but the use case is, unlike the way eRIS works right now, where eRIS makes a request, well, the user makes the request of eRIS, eRIS then makes the request on behalf of the user to go get data. We can move data without that original initiation from the end user and simply move data from one place to another place just by using this agent. And in one of the new upcoming implementations of eRIS, we're doing that because the data is going to start in a secure SCADA zone with no external connections. And we're going to be using this thing called a FEN diode, which is a one-way only device. And so there was no way for a request to ever go in. So we're just simply going to push data out of the SCADA zone. And hey, where is it going to go? Well, it's going to go to the new eRIS historian that John's going to show next. So this is the use case, but we wanted to show everyone else because we believe there may be other places where this type of data transfer, either it's from a secure location where you don't want to punch a hole or you don't want to have two-way communication, so we can simply put this agent near that data and just push it to eRIS or to someplace else, to like an FTP, or it's in a network where that two-way communication is difficult to happen or not consistent, and you want a certain part of the data, you can then just have it automatically push data rather than having this request pull type of relationship. So that's the background behind it. So I'll shut up now and let anybody else have any questions, but that's really the background.
Any questions or thoughts from anyone else? That is no two. Move on to the eRIS historian. So Tim did previously mention it. It didn't make it on those diagrams before, but in that one installation, we are pushing data using the new agent. It's kind of what motivated the start of that agent with the export abilities into what we're calling a new product, eRIS historian. So what is it? It's a new product. It's separate from eRIS. It's going to live outside of that eRIS VM or world on its own VM or own environment. It is a data historian. It's for data summarization tools and aggregates, something we haven't typically done in the past, but we're going to do that now under this eRIS historian blanket. And what's under the hood of it? There's a UI management tool. There's a Python REST API, and it is backed by a Postgres timescale database under the hood of that as well. So the purpose is to store large amounts of time series data, more or less. Its goals are fast queries, fast inserts, allow for some faster time aggregated queries using something timescale calls time bucket, and it's got an integration with eRIS as well, of course. So this is a diagram of what eRIS Historian looks like. There is a built-in already eRIS tag provider starting in the 3.2 version of eRIS that can connect to an eRIS Historian. The tag provider can obviously get tags and get data, nothing that we're not familiar with or you're not familiar with in a previous or existing tag provider within the eRIS system. And then under that, there are tag stores that are tag tables and tag data tables that are unique across stores. I'll get into stores in a bit. So here are the stores. Each tag store is kind of like a bit of a container or a separation of different types of data. So when you load up the eRIS Historian for the first time, you get one tag store. It's just called the eRIS tag store. But of course, you can add more just to separate logical groupings of data. The tag store has a tag table, just like our current eRIS tag provider has a tag table and a data table, which is something you might not see up front, but something how it's stored in the backend. And the data table is something called a hypertable from timescale. And timescale uses that to increase performance on how data can be extracted and queried. So this is something we have here is it's a typical tag provider. The typical tag provider requests, 2 tags with an average for 1 hour. Does that source support aggregate modes? For someone like Prophecy, yes, Prophecy supports some aggregations like averages and interpolated, min-max. So we'll ask Prophecy to do that summarization for us. But I'd say a majority of our providers, especially the ones we've been writing lately, they don't really support any aggregation. They just go right, and we just get all the raw tag data, and then eRIS is the one that has to deal with the summarization of that data itself. So typically this can take a little bit more time if we have to pull in the data and then summarize it ourselves, rather than asking the source or the database to do it for us. The eRIS Historian does kind of work in the same way. However, we can use time bucket is what it's called. And a time bucket basically is a built-in function within the timescale database that allows us to say for this time period, do we want min, max, average, sum, and for what interval? So instead of eRIS having to summarize that data, we'll actually have the eRIS Historian do that ourselves. So I'm going to skip that part. I'm actually going to run over here to an eRIS Historian. So I talked about the UI management tool. This is kind of what it looks like at this point, and I have a eRIS Historian running locally, similar in a way to our mobile app login here. Hopefully no keyboard's getting your way, Juan, but we'll log in, jump into the tags. So what are tag stores themselves? Tag stores, we can create a new one here. We can call this our demo tag store. And we can give it a description for what's new in eRIS. And we just need to give it a prefix, demo store. There is a quality minimum. So what is bad quality? Anything less than this value is bad quality. So I'll leave this to 100. Tag stores get created. You are allowed to then create tags under this tag store environment. And that is separate from the previous eRIS tag store, which comes by default that you do or don't need to use. Under tags, you can create tags on here, or you can have the eRIS tag provider create those tags for you as well. So if you set those up in a data entry form kind of concept, or if you're importing data that we talked about through this previous eRIS Historian, tags will get created through that provider as well into the eRIS Historian. So here I have a bunch of tags here that have just been created, and I can see, kind of preview some of the data that's been stored in here. It's kind of hard to show off a lot of it, but I think right now I'm running, this Historian has, I think about 4 million data points at this time, which might seem like nothing compared to some historians that people are running, but here you can kind of edit what a tag is. And this is all, again, separate from eRIS. This is not done in eRIS. This is all done through the eRIS Historian Manager. You can peruse some of the data here, take a look at it, set intervals for data. So here are my tags for this eRIS Historian. If I go over to my local eRIS, Then I go into my tag table providers. I have an eRIS historian provider here set up. So if I edit this, I can take a look. Similar settings that we might all be used to in an eRIS tag provider. Server address is where we're going. Then you can also specify this tag store prefix. So which tag store do you want this tag provider to be connected to on the eRIS historian side? So I have mine connected to this eRIS tag store because I have 5 tags already, and these 5 tags have data in them as well. So I can select different tags and I can see the different values for them. I don't think that D or E have any data at the moment. So A, B, and C have data. There will be other features added into this manager later about performance updates and how the system's doing. But I want to run a tag query here. It's under my WebEx window. So I'm an eRIS historian. I can go January 1st. I'm going to do 2 months. I'm just going to run it. So this is asking the eRIS historian for 2 months of hourly average data. And that's our response time for that aggregated timestamp. So I have hourly averages here for 3 tags, and that seemed to come back relatively quickly with all this data here that's charted in this weird squiggly line. I can go back to a month and run this. Obviously, this is going to be quicker, but relatively quick for the average and the time that I'm actually executing here. There is something else we're creating and playing with, is this aggregate option here. These aggregates allow us to, if you know that you're running, if you're typically looking at hourly averages or on a regular basis, that's what you care about the most, hourly averages, then you can set that up in an aggregate setting. These aggregates or continuous aggregates from timescale allow you to aggregate data on a regular basis, so you don't have to re-query them every time. They actually get stored in a different way. So these queries should be even faster. So that when you actually ask for data for hourly, the eRIS historian will say, hey, we've created something like that for you in timescale and Postgres, so we're just going to look at that view instead. If you haven't created that, that doesn't mean it's still not going to be quick. It's still going to use timescale leveraged time bucket to make queries, so that your data can come back the fastest. And the supported modes, I think, are average, min, max, total, or sum that are kind of baked in right now, and we'll be working on adding more to those later as well. This is what I have for the eRIS historian. I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything you want me to dive into more specifically for the historian. I don't want to get too technical on the back end of how it works in the database, but this is something that we're hoping can speed up queries. Previously, we've stored data in we connect to every kind of data source that we can think of, from MySQL, Oracle, Postgres. We've already connected to Postgres and SQL Server. They just don't seem to have the kind of abilities to leverage aggregations like timescale does. And so that's really kind of stepped up our game here for the ability for even just some of our ET tags. If you're storing lots of data in a different way there, if we can do it through the use of historian, then the queries might be able to come back a lot faster based off of the new settings that we've kind of built around this historian.
And it also, the other thing too is, a lot of times, especially when we first originally implemented eRIS, so people who have been customers for 5, 6, 7 years, we often built a lot of our, what we call eRIS data, is on the same server as eRIS. And that has some challenges because you can't, if you're running the database tools that come with MySQL, which is that data stored in, you still have to run that on the same server that eRIS is running. So it takes resources away from the eRIS server. And you have kind of this cross manipulation or cross contamination of data because you've got eRIS configuration files alongside or next door to eRIS data. And this is a much cleaner way to store that data on a separate server, allows for easier backups, easier replications without having to replicate the whole eRIS server as well. So it adds a little bit of integrity to that. As John mentioned, this is a separate product. So in the past, even if we had created a separate database for eRIS data, we called it, we never really charged anything for that. It would just be spun up as a separate eRIS, as a separate server, but there was no cost to this. This historian, since it does add significant value and it has a user interface, it's not just a database, does have a cost associated with it. So it's not designed to replace necessarily what we already have implemented, but it is designed to replace, if you have a need to store lots of data and you don't really have a place for it, but you want to have it connected to eRIS and you want to have some historian type tools like the aggregations that John talked about, which aren't native to most just regular databases like a SQL Server database or an even a MySQL database doesn't have these kind of aggregation tools built in. This might be a great alternative for you. So something to think about.
Yeah, and here's just a quick example of how you could create an aggregate here is you have to just give your aggregate a name. What's the interval you want this? So I want maximum and averages for a day. At what store does this go to? Again, eRIS stores are kind of their own little aggregations of data, and which tags in that store. So you can choose however many of them you want to be used in this aggregation. You might only have 5 tags that you really care about hourly averages. Some of them you might want daily averages. We're going to change this to hourly. The start offset and end offset and the scheduled interval are just how timescale is managing the updating of this aggregation. It does re-aggregate when new data comes in, so it keeps that up to date. But this is just how the policy of how it refreshes this. So every week it's going to go back 6 months and run 3 months of aggregates. And these are settings that we'll have to play around with per use case of what we want to do and what data is coming in. I can try and save that aggregation. Sometimes it takes a minute. And I have a new aggregate created. You can already see the data down here. Tag is just an ID instead of the tag name here, but now all the data is actually aggregated that I have locally in this kind of time frame. This is all mostly using timescale tools. You can check timescale out. They got some good documentation and pretty good motivation for why they're doing what they're doing. I'll open it to the floor if anyone has anything on the eRIS historian.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, sorry. Do we need, does this historian need all the raw data to do this, or can it refer to, I guess, existing tags in eRIS and then extrapolate the aggregate data?
It would have to be so the data would have to be stored within the eRIS historian box itself. So it would have to be migrated into the historian in order to build that. But we could, depending on, I've been thinking that we might have a bit of a migration path from what we would call our ET or eRIS tags into the historian, so that you could push that data easily into an eRIS historian if that was a way that you wanted to switch, or that was the data you wanted to migrate into the historian. Moving data or having aggregates on existing data sets, we would have to find a migration path to put that data into the historian for it to work. It's not as where eRIS was kind of designed to go out and connect to multiple and different types and flavors of databases and APIs and different connections out there on the web. eRIS historian is mostly meant for it's one data source or data structure, which is Postgres.
Thank you.
But an example of a way to do that is if you had a data source that didn't have any kind of summarized or aggregated data, but it had a lot of value. If you added that to that, this is a use case where we could simply add the agent to that original source and just automatically push that data to an eRIS historian, and then use eRIS to, instead of connecting to the original source, it would just simply connect to the new eRIS historian, which is like, it is a copy of that data, but it's a copy that's been enhanced with the summarization data, which would make it a lot more valuable as well. So just something to think about. It gives you a way to give you more value out of a data source, and with that new agent, it's really easy for us to go and backfill data if we needed to. So, if there was a change in data at the source and you wanted to make sure that you refreshed or updated the historian, you'd simply just make an adjustment in the agent, which would then push the data and upload and update the historian data. So I hope I said that right, John.
Yeah,
It does that.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically how the agent was kind of rebirthed in this new version, was because we wanted to export data from one place into our historian. You could even go further than that too. You don't even need to use the remote agent necessarily to migrate data, because we do have built in eRIS, we have ETL jobs where you can move data from one tag provider to another. So technically, there's already a migration path set forward within eRIS, and you could say whatever data is in this tag provider, I want it in this tag provider, and your target tag provider would just need to be the eRIS historian, and eRIS would push that data into the historian, where all of those new aggregatings and summarization functions would be able to take place.
Yeah, good point. Forgot about that as well. The agent is just a really light way to do it, and from places that may not be connected to eRIS. You could do that and send it through to an FTP site that eRIS is connected to. So you could do it from like remote sites and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. So a really, really, really kind of technical new features. We purposely did that this time because kind of an exciting announcement. We have a new version of eRIS 3.2. So John, you want to tease that a little bit for next time?
Yeah, eRIS 3.2 is obviously something we've been trying to get right for a little while. Just make sure it's really ready for everyone. One of the big selling points that I would say, and I don't want to go too technical again on you, Tim, but previously our configuration, some of the configuration settings, things like your mail server, those are stored in a configuration file on the eRIS machine. We're trying to move away from that. One, for security reasons, that we can just encrypt things a little nicer in the database that we're using. But also, every time that we needed to make a change to something like the mail server, we'd have to change that configuration file, and then we'd have to restart your eRIS, which meant downtime. So anytime we wanted to make a little change or a tweak, or you move mail servers, or you wanted to change an interval on some setting within eRIS, it always required a restore, a reset, or refresh of the eRIS application. So there would be downtime involved. Where the biggest thing with eRIS 3.2 is that can all be done without requiring a reset. And these can just be done within the database itself for now. Down the road, and the next version of eRIS will also allow a portlet where administrators can configure that as well, to make those changes on the fly without having to reset everything. So one, this adds security. We're more secure control of those settings. Two, it's not on a text file on the system anymore, so we don't need downtime when we restart, so that all the services need to restart and reread that configuration file. And three, it also allows us to move more towards the Nova aspect of eRIS for the higher model, where you have multiple servers running at the same time. They're not all reading from the same text file that you have duplicated on 3 different servers. they're all reading from the same configuration data source. So that setting is replicated amongst all three of them. That's probably the biggest change in 3.2 as a core feature. So that's why we've wanted to test it really well, so that we make sure that those configuration settings that get made still hold and still work across the system. But I would have to say that the 3.2 version also, I think, has had one of our best test pushes in a while. And we've uncovered a lot of different bugs, which might be small bugs, but can also be great annoyances with 3.2. So we've had a really good push and a really good version so far with the 3.2 that we've just started building production ready last week. So we didn't think we were going to go into it too much today as an overall version, but we did get it finished about a week or two ago.
And so that will be, a lot of that will be the topic of conversation at the next What's New in eRIS when we do that next quarter.
Yeah. Great.
Great.
Well, if anyone has any questions or something comes up, you can email support, email me. We can just talk it over then. Do you have anything else, Tim?
Nope. I just want to thank everybody for being great eRIS partners. Love to hear how you're using it, how better we can support you. And, you know, always love to have new ideas. So thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tom.
all.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.